The soft hum of cameras was the first sound that filled the chamber, a low electric buzz that seemed to coil itself around the walls of history. Behind it came the whispers, staffers leaning in close to each other, the shuffle of papers being slid across the table, the muted cough of a restless aide. Every sound seemed magnified in the heavy air, as though the room itself understood what was about to unfold. At the long oak bench, Liz Cheney sat upright, posture rigid, jaw clenched in a way that betrayed both tension and purpose. Her papers were neatly stacked before her, not as mere notes but as sharpened blades. Evidence, precedent, speeches, fragments of fury disguised as arguments. Her eyes moved across the chamber with a soldier's discipline, scanning faces, weighing allies against adversaries. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett did not fidget, did not rearrange her notes, did not even shift her weight. She sat as though, rooted into the very floor of the chamber, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze calm and piercing. Where Cheney's every movement was taut with preparation, Crockett radiated stillness, an observer of chaos rather than a participant in it. There was something unnerving about that stillness. In the political theater where noise was currency, silence was rebellion. The journalists positioned in the gallery felt it immediately. They scribbled quick notes, exchanging hushed comments. 2 women, 2 storms, 2 worlds colliding. Even before the gavel fell, the story had written itself. Cheney leaned slightly forward, her lips tightening as if rehearsing the blows she was about to deliver. Inside her mind, she repeated the lines like a mantra. This was not just about politics. It was about truth, about principle, about clawing back dignity in an age of fractured loyalty. She carried the burden of history, her father's shadow heavy against her back, and she would not allow herself to falter here, not tonight. Crockett, meanwhile, breathed slow, steady breaths. She had been underestimated before, dismissed as too sharp, too loud, too unwilling to play by the old rules. Tonight she would not need to raise her voice. She could feel it already, the energy of the chamber shifting toward her calm, as though history itself was leaning in to watch what silence could do against rage. The gavel struck, and the room hushed into brittle silence. The premonition was undeniable. This night would not end with a compromise, but with a reckoning. And somewhere, beneath the polished oak and artificial lights, silence prepared to roar louder than fury. Under the glare of the chamber's lights, Liz Cheney felt the air thicken around her shoulders like an invisible weight. The oak desk before her was steady, but inside her thoughts churned with an intensity that betrayed no outward crack in her composure. To those watching, senators, aides, the press, she appeared exactly as they expected, a Cheney, sharp and unyielding, bred for conflict in the halls of power. But her story, the years of scars and betrayals that had carried her here, vibrated beneath the surface of her calm, like thunder rumbling below a deceptively clear sky. Her father's shadow was always present in rooms like this. To some, Dick Cheney was a statesman, a strategist who had wielded American power with ruthless clarity. To others, he was the architect of shadows, the face of wars that never seemed to end. Liz knew this legacy was both armor and burden. Every time she entered these chambers, she carried the weight of his choices, the suspicion of his enemies, and the loyalty of those who believed her courage was inherited rather than earned. She remembered her earliest days in politics, how colleagues dismissed her at first as little more than an extension of her father's will. But she had learned quickly, fought ferociously, and carved her own reputation as someone unafraid to challenge even her own allies. It was that streak of defiance, that stubborn devotion to principle, that had isolated her in recent years. She had walked away from party loyalty when it demanded submission to falsehood. She had stood in defiance, knowing it could cost her everything, and yet, even now, she could not stop herself from believing that history would remember her stance as righteous. Tonight, though, history's judgment felt closer, heavier, more immediate. Her gaze landed on Jasmine Crockett, young, unflinching, unscarred by the same years of trench warfare Cheney had endured. There was a sharpness to Crockett's stillness that Cheney found almost insulting. How can she sit there so calmly? Cheney thought. Does she not understand the stakes? Does she not see the weight of this moment? Cheney shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the neat stack of papers. They were not just arguments. They were reminders of battles fought, policies debated, oaths sworn. Each sheet was a fragment of her defense against a world that seemed determined to paint her as either villain or martyr. She had learned that to survive in politics, one had to wield words as weapons and rage as shield. Silence, she believed, was weakness. The chamber's atmosphere recalled to her another moment, a memory seared into her bones. Years ago, in a closed-door committee meeting, she had stood against the tide of her own party, insisting on accountability where others wanted compromise. The looks she received then were the same looks Crockett gave her now. Calm, observant, silent. And it had infuriated her then too, because silence suggested judgment without engagement, condemnation without courage. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Never let them see you falter. Never let silence win. In politics, silence is surrender, but Liz Cheney was not her father. She was something different, forged from his steel but tempered by her own wounds. And yet part of her still sought his approval, even in the grave silence of memory. She wanted to win here, not for headlines, not even for herself, but for the principle that truth required defenders willing to bleed for it. The cameras shifted, their red lights blinking like the eyes of vultures circling above. She knew the world was watching, dissecting every twitch of her jaw, every flicker in her eyes. And she knew with bitter certainty that for many watching, this moment was not about truth at all. It was about theater, spectacle. Who shouted the loudest? Who looked the most unshakable? Her thoughts darkened as she studied Crockett again. Crockett represented something larger than herself. A rising generation that defied the old codes of combat. A new voice unwilling to bend under the weight of history's dynasties. Cheney had faced men like that before, but this was different. Crockett's weapon was not aggression, but presence. A stillness that mocked Cheney's storms. Don't confuse calm with strength, Cheney muttered under her breath, too low for the microphones to catch. It was as much a warning to herself as to the woman across from her. The chamber buzzed with low conversation, a prelude to the gavel that would soon demand order. Yet in those brief, unscripted seconds before the clash began, Cheney felt the full sweep of her life pressing in on her. The wars fought abroad, the battles waged at home, the exile from her party, the loss of colleagues who had once clasped her hand with loyalty. All of it had brought her here, to this chamber, to this confrontation. The irony was not lost on her. For years she had been accused of being too loyal, too much her father's daughter, too unwilling to question authority. Now she was accused of betrayal, of turning her back on her tribe. In the end, loyalty had broken her, and defiance had left her standing alone. She wondered just briefly if Crockett knew that feeling, the ache of isolation, the chill of standing on principle when it costs everything. But Crockett gave no sign, only that unnerving smile at the edges of her mouth, a smile Cheney already despised. A young aide leaned toward Cheney and whispered, "Ma'am, are you ready?" Cheney didn't answer immediately. She kept her eyes locked on Crockett, studying the calm across the aisle, weighing it against her own fury. Finally, she whispered back, her voice low, steady, but carrying the tremor of something deeper. "Ready? I was born for this." The aide withdrew and Cheney straightened her papers once more. The room's murmur began to fade as the gavel lifted in the chairman's hand. The chamber was about to fall into enforced silence. And Cheney, whose life had been defined by battles, waged with fire and fury, steeled herself for the fight. Somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of resolve, a faint doubt flickered. What if silence really is stronger than rage? What if tonight, the storm loses to the calm? But Liz Cheney crushed the thought. She leaned forward, eyes fixed, ready to strike. When the gavel fell, her explosion would not be delayed any longer. The gavel cracked against the desk like a shot fired into the hush of the chamber. A ripple moved across the room, Journalists leaning forward in the gallery, aides shuffling hurried notes, members of Congress straightening in their seats. All of them knew what this was. A collision staged in public view, two worlds grinding against each other under the scrutiny of the cameras. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, as though the sound had not touched her. She had been in rooms like this before. Courtrooms thick with expectation. Hearing chambers where power dripped from the air like humidity. Spaces where her voice was weighed not by its truth, but by how much it disturbed the comfort of those listening. She knew the script these rooms demanded. Raise your voice, wave your papers, lean into the microphone as though the performance itself was proof of conviction. But she had long since decided she would not be bent into someone else's shape. Tonight she would not play by their rules. Her silence unnerved them, and she knew it. She had learned long ago that people expected her to fight loudly, to storm, into arguments with fire on her tongue and heat in her eyes. That was the stereotype they whispered about, the box they tried to force her into. The angry black woman, too loud, too reckless, too emotional to be taken seriously. They didn't expect her restraint, and restraint unsettled them more than rage ever could. Across the aisle, Liz Cheney radiated a storm barely contained. Crockett could feel it pulsing from her, rage sharpened into words, discipline cracking under the weight of legacy and betrayal. Cheney's papers rustled in her hands like weapons waiting to be unsheathed. Crockett almost pitied her. Almost. For Crockett, politics had never been about family names or inherited power. Her story began in crowded courtrooms back in Texas, where she stood as a public defender against a system that saw her clients as disposable. She remembered the looks judges gave her, the smirks from prosecutors who thought she was out of her depth. She remembered learning that silence could be its own argument, that waiting for the other side to unravel was sometimes more powerful than any speech she could give. That lesson was etched into her tonight. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory, a reminder stitched into her bones. You don't always need to fight fire with fire, Jasmine. Sometimes you just have to let them burn themselves out. The gavel's echo was still fading when Cheney leaned forward, already bristling with words. Crockett did not flinch, did not adjust the microphone, did not even blink. She sat as though carved from stone, her eyes locked on Cheney's face, her breathing slow, her expression unreadable save for that faint, deliberate calm. It was working. She could see it in the twitch of Cheney's jaw, the way her opponent's composure cracked under the weight of silence. The journalists saw it too. Pens scratched across paper, cameras zoomed tighter, their glass eyes capturing every flicker, every pause. The narrative was already being written in the small gestures, long before the words themselves filled the air. Crockett let her mind drift briefly to the stakes. This was not just about her and Cheney. It was about the systems watching from beyond these walls, the voters who wanted proof that someone like her could stand unshaken in the halls of power, the young women who might see in her composure permission to believe they too belonged here. She bore that responsibility as much as she bore her own survival. A voice inside her reminded her that survival had always demanded calculation. In the courtroom, she had learned that anger made her clients look guilty before they ever spoke. In politics, she had learned that her anger would be weaponized against her before her arguments were even heard. She had been trained by the system itself to wield silence like a blade, but she also knew silence alone was not enough. There would come a moment when she would need to speak, when one carefully chosen sentence could cut deeper than all of Cheney's thunder. She was saving it, waiting for the right opening, letting Cheney's fury dig its own grave. The gavel struck again. The chairman's voice droned about procedure, decorum, the rules of engagement. But no one in the chamber was really listening. All eyes remained on Cheney and Crockett, the storm and the stillness, the dynasty and the defiance. Cheney shifted in her chair, sensing the weight of Crockett's quiet. She thinks silence is strength, Cheney thought bitterly. But I'll drag her into the fight. Crockett's mind, in contrast, was still. She thought only of the rhythm of her breathing, the steady beat of her heart. She imagined herself back in a courtroom with a young client whose life hung in the balance, reminding him to stay calm, to let the prosecution tire themselves out. That same patience was now her shield. The first words had not yet been spoken, but already the fight had begun. And Crockett knew, felt it in her bones, that silence was winning. The chairman's final procedural notes faded into the background. The chamber stilled once more. Crockett lifted her eyes, let them settle squarely on Cheney, and offered the faintest hint of a smile, barely perceptible but deliberate like a spark placed on dry tinder. It was not arrogance. It was a message. I am not afraid of your storm. And just like that, the room seemed to tilt. Cheney stiffened, her fury pushing against invisible walls, desperate to break free. The journalists scribbled furiously, sensing that the smallest gestures tonight would carry the weight of headlines tomorrow. Crockett folded her hands together once more and waited. She had entered this chamber not to shout, not to prove her worth by matching volume with volume, but to remind them all that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was the refusal to move, the refusal to be rattled, the refusal to give your opponent the satisfaction of reaction. And in that refusal, in that quiet defiance, Jasmine Crockett prepared to let Liz Cheney burn herself out. The air tightened as the chairman's words dissolved into the ether, leaving behind only the hum of cameras and the brittle expectation of an audience craving sparks. Liz Cheney felt the weight of every eye on her, every microphone tuned to the cadence of her voice. Her fingers pressed into the edge of her papers until the corners cut into her skin. She had waited long enough. Tonight was not about procedure. It was about confrontation. It was about proving that silence, no matter how steady, could not smother truth. Her voice broke the stillness like glass shattering. Congresswoman Crockett, she began, tone sharp, syllables clipped, each word like the crack of a whip. Your approach here tonight, your refusal to engage, your performance of composure isn't courage. It's dereliction. It's the abdication of responsibility. Gasps rippled across the chamber, subtle but undeniable. Cheney's tone had skipped past civility and landed in accusation. The press gallery leaned in closer. Cheney pressed forward, seizing the silence as a canvas for her fury. You present yourself as calm, she continued, eyes narrowing. But calm does not absolve you of accountability. Calm does not erase the recklessness of your positions. Calm does not shield you from the truth that what you represent, Congresswoman, is not strength, but spectacle, a theater of passivity dressed as principle. She felt the adrenaline surge in her veins as she delivered the blows. Words she had rehearsed, sharpened, polished like knives. She could see staffers on her side nodding faintly, relief flickering across their faces. For them, Cheney's explosion was a defense not just of policy but of the order of things, the expectation that power must be asserted, that noise was proof of conviction. And yet across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett did not move. Her gaze remained fixed, her hands folded neatly. Together, her face composed as if she were listening not to an adversary but to a story told from far away. That faint, enigmatic calm still framed her expression, a presence so steady it seemed almost unnatural against Cheney's storm. The silence after Cheney's words grew louder than the words themselves. Crockett let it linger, stretching second after second, letting Cheney's accusations dangle in the air, raw and unresolved. The silence was not absence, it was weight, pressing down on Cheney, turning her fury into something desperate. Cameras zoomed closer. Reporters scribbled, Cheney attacks. Crockett unmoved. The spectacle was shifting in real time. Cheney's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted a reaction, needed one. Crockett's refusal to respond, her refusal to so much as flinch, made Cheney's own anger echo louder, hollower. Cheney raised her voice further. You want the American people to see you as some symbol of progress, she thundered. But what they see, what I see, is a refusal to confront hard truths. You sit there in silence while this institution burns around you. Do you think that makes you strong? Do you think a smile will save the Constitution? Do you think stillness is leadership? Her words reverberated in the chamber, thick with venom. But when they landed, they found no resistance, no counterstrike, no fuel for the fire. Crockett sat motionless, her lips curving just faintly at the corner. Not smug, not mocking, but serene, as if Cheney's rage were nothing more than weather passing over stone. The smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it gutted Cheney's, momentum like a blade to the chest. For one instant, Cheney faltered mid-sentence, her voice catching on her next word. That pause, tiny, fragile, was seized by the cameras, magnified by the audience, immortalized in the pens of journalists who knew the true power of a single moment. Inside, Cheney burned hotter. She dares smile? She dares dismiss me with silence? Fury clawed at her throat, demanding release. She slammed her palm against the stack of papers, the sound cracking across the chamber. "This is not a game," Cheney shouted. "This is not about your composure or your image or whatever smile you think will carry you through. This is about democracy itself. And democracy demands confrontation. Democracy demands that we fight for truth, not sit smugly in silence while others do the work." Her voice trembled, not with weakness but with the rawness of conviction fraying at the edges. She was not just attacking Crockett anymore. She was shouting at ghosts, at colleagues who had abandoned her, at a party that had exiled her, at a legacy she could not escape. But Crockett only tilted her head slightly, her eyes steady, her silence sharper than any retort. To the public eye, Cheney's explosion looked less like righteous fury and more like desperation. Crockett's restraint, once dismissed as weakness, now read as strength, discipline, mastery of the stage without raising a single word. Inside Crockett's mind, 1,000 memories stirred. The courtrooms where she had been underestimated, the late nights preparing for hearings where no one believed in her clients, the protests where her voice had been drowned by jeers. She had learned through each trial that silence could be survival, that sometimes the best way to win was to let the other side unravel themselves, and unravel Cheney was. "Answer me," Cheney barked finally, her voice cracking under the weight of its own force. "If you stand for something, then say it. If you believe in truth, then speak it." The chamber went deathly quiet. Every eye turned to Crockett, waiting for her reply. But she did not rush. She did not scramble to fill the silence. She simply breathed, let her gaze linger, and then, softly, deliberately, let a single sentence fall from her lips. If truth needs shouting to stand, was it ever truth at all? The words landed with the weight of a gavel, silencing the chamber in an instant. Even Cheney froze, her breath caught, her fury stunned into stillness. The audience felt it, reporters, aides, members of Congress alike. That one sentence, spoken, with quiet precision, cut deeper than all of Cheney's roaring. Crockett had not only defended herself, she had turned Cheney's rage into its own indictment. For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Cameras whirred softly, capturing history. In the making, Cheney's hands trembled against her papers. She wanted to speak, to strike back, but the chamber's silence had shifted, and for the first time it was not on her side. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett let her smile linger, not wide, not mocking, but serene. The storm had crashed, and the calm had endured, and everyone in the room knew it. The echoes of Crockett's soft words still hung in the chamber when the gavel struck, adjournment declared, and the press surged like a tidal wave. Outside those heavy doors, the fight was no longer contained to the mahogany walls and glassy stares of politicians. It spilled into the streets, into television studios, into the endless churn of social media feeds that demanded blood, demanded clarity, demanded narrative. By dawn the next morning, every network had replayed the footage 100 times over. On cable news, Cheney's fist slamming against her papers became a looped symbol of fury. Crockett's calm, her quiet sentence, her faint smile became something else entirely, an emblem of resistance, of composure in the face of attack. Commentators scrambled to name the moment, christening it the smile that silenced the chamber. Across one panel, conservative voices applauded Cheney's fire, praising her for refusing to accept political theater disguised as restraint. But in the same breath, they could not ignore how rattled she looked, how Crockett's silence had made Cheney's fury seem unhinged rather than powerful. One commentator muttered, half in disbelief. You can almost hear the air leave the room when Crockett finally spoke. In liberal circles, Crockett's restraint became legend overnight. Hashtags bloomed. Silent strength, smile and stand, Crockett calm. Memes filled timelines, not mocking Cheney outright, but immortalizing that stillness, that poise that had reduced her storm to background noise. Side-by-side images circulated. Cheney's face flushed with anger versus Crockett's measured serenity. The contrast was cinematic, almost biblical, rage undone by calm. But beneath the noise, a deeper current stirred. Philosophers, columnists, even late-night hosts began asking, what is power? Is it the loudest voice in the room, or the quietest? Was Cheney right to equate passion with leadership, or had Crockett unveiled a different truth, that leadership sometimes meant absorbing the storm without letting it define you? In smoky backrooms, strategists panicked. Cheney's allies feared the narrative was slipping from their hands. She looked unhinged, one aide hissed, pacing before a wall of muted TV screens replaying the moment again and again. We needed her to look strong, decisive. Instead, she looks desperate. Another aide countered. No, the base loves passion. They love the fire. We lean into it. We say Crockett's smile is smugness, arrogance, dismissal of real issues. Meanwhile, Crockett's team kept remarkably quiet. No press tours, no triumphant declarations. Instead, Crockett herself slipped away into private meetings, her smile still intact, but her heart pounding with the enormity of what had unfolded. She had not planned for her silence to become a spectacle. She had only leaned on instinct, on the lessons of her past, on the truth that sometimes the hardest thing to do was nothing at all. But America was already deciding what that smile meant. In one viral clip, a college student watching the hearing whispered to her roommate. She didn't even have to shout. She didn't even have to fight. She just waited. And that was enough. The clip spread like wildfire, millions of views pouring in, rebranded with captions like "Strength Redefined" and "The Power of Stillness." Yet not all voices were reverent. On certain networks, Crockett was branded manipulative, a stone-faced opportunist exploiting optics instead of offering substance. What did she actually say? A pundit demanded, slamming his desk. One sentence, one, and suddenly, she's the hero? Cheney gave detail, passion, truth. Crockett gave theater. The polarization deepened. Online battles raged. Digital courtrooms where strangers played jury and judge. For every admirer calling Crockett's silence revolutionary, another accused her of smugness, cowardice, elitism. Hashtags in defense of Cheney. Fight for Truth, Liz Leeds, competed bitterly with Crockett's viral storm. But in living rooms, in bars, in hushed subway cars, ordinary people whispered something simpler. They whispered about the look in Crockett's eyes, about the way Cheney's words had collapsed against a wall of quiet. They whispered about the audacity of calm in a world that demanded rage. They whispered about how, for the first time, a hearing had felt less like politics and more like theater that spoke to their own lives. The fights they endured silently at work, the storms they weathered in relationships, the power they sometimes found in saying nothing. And while the public roared, Cheney herself seethed. From her office window, she watched a television replay, the screen muted, but the images searing her mind. Her own clenched fist, her trembling papers, Crockett's serene smile. Every time she watched, the humiliation deepened. It wasn't just political, it was personal. Crockett had made her look like a relic of a world that believed shouting could command truth. She gathered her aides late that night, her voice low but sharp. They think she won because she said nothing. Fine. Then we make the case that silence is weakness, that leaders don't hide behind smiles, that strength means standing in the fire, not pretending it doesn't exist. But even as she spoke, part of her knew the battle had shifted. She was no longer fighting just Crockett. She was fighting perception, symbolism, the viral myth of the smile that had outlasted the storm. And Crockett? She sat in her own office, the buzz of her phone ignored, the world outside her door raging with newfound adoration or scorn. Alone, she exhaled, her smile fading into something weary, human. For all the power people ascribed to it, she knew it had cost her something to hold silence in the face of fire, to carry centuries of expectation in one still gesture. But for now, the world had made its choice. Cheney's explosion was the headline, Crockett's silence was the story, and the court of public opinion had just declared its first verdict. The headlines had not cooled when the real fractures began to appear. Capitol Hill, already a house of glass and smoke, felt the tremors of the Crockett-Cheney confrontation ripple through its foundations. Offices buzzed with speculation, aides whispered about allegiances, and the invisible lines that had always cut through the body politic now burned like scars lit by fire. Behind closed doors, Cheney gathered her allies in a small conference room tucked beneath the rotunda. The walls hummed with fluorescent light, the table littered with coffee cups and scattered notes. Her face bore the fatigue of long nights, but her voice remained sharp, commanding. "This narrative is killing us," she said flatly. Every replay, every meme, every smug headline, it makes me the villain and her the saint. I will not have my legacy reduced to a 15-second clip. An aide, younger and more nervous than the others, cleared his throat. We could double down, Congresswoman, lean into the passion, say that her silence was disrespect. Frame it as dereliction of duty. Cheney's eyes narrowed. And if people believe the opposite, if they see her stillness as dignity and mine as desperation, we risk solidifying their story. No. We must move the ground beneath her feet. We must make this about substance, about who has the courage to speak, not who has the discipline to smile. Silence fell heavy and uneasy. They all knew it. The political battle had shifted. It was no longer about what was said in that chamber. It was about what those moments symbolized. And symbols had a way of escaping control. Across the aisle, in a quieter wing of the Capitol, Crockett sat with a handful of confidants. She listened more than she spoke, letting her aides debate whether to ride the wave of viral fame or retreat into disciplined silence. "Congresswoman," one urged, "this is the moment to strike. Book the interviews. Own the narrative. People already believe in your strength. Show them it wasn't just optics." Another shook her head. "No. The smile is powerful precisely because it wasn't a performance. If she runs to every microphone, now it looks like theater. Let Cheney burn herself out. The country has already seen what they needed to see." Crockett rubbed her temples, weary of the circus that politics turned every human gesture into. She had grown up understanding that silence could be survival, that calm could be resistance. But here, on the stage of American power, silence had been recast as spectacle. She did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. Beneath these private debates, the deeper tremors began to show. Committees splintered, with members quietly aligning themselves behind either woman. Not openly, not yet, but in the small courtesies of politics, the withheld handshake, the sudden smile in the hallway, the vote delayed without explanation. The fault lines were visible to anyone who had learned to read the language of Washington. In one tense committee meeting days later, Cheney and Crockett found themselves again seated only a few feet apart. No eruption came this time, no viral moment. But the air itself seemed to bristle. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition, not of respect, not yet, but of inevitability. They were no longer two women from different worlds. They were now opposing poles in a fight that stretched far beyond themselves. Cheney leaned forward, voice measured, deliberately calm. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, "our constituents expect substance, not symbolism. We are not performers in a morality play." Crockett tilted her head, her smile soft, almost imperceptible. "Sometimes, Congresswoman, the greatest substance lies in restraint. This chamber is already drowning in noise." The words were quiet, but they landed like a gavel. A few members shifted in their seats. A staffer scribbled furiously in his notebook. Everyone knew the exchange would never make the evening news, but those in the room felt the earth shift another inch. Outside, commentators fanned the flames. Some cast Cheney as a warrior clinging to relevance, others as a truth-teller suffocated by performative calm. Crockett was painted alternately as a master of quiet strength or a cynical manipulator who let silence do the work of integrity. The divide was not just political, it was generational, cultural, almost spiritual. The nation seemed to split along the fault line between fury and calm. To one half of the country, Cheney embodied the righteous fire of conviction, a refusal to let truth be swallowed in silence. To the other half, Crockett represented a new kind of leadership, one that refused to be baited into chaos, that turned noise against itself by refusing to echo it. Late one night, Crockett sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering through the blinds. She thought of her grandmother who had once told her, "Child, sometimes the loudest voice is the one that doesn't speak. But don't forget, silence is never free. It costs you." She wondered now what that cost would be. The admiration of strangers was fleeting, she knew. The fury of opponents was enduring. And yet deep inside she felt a strange steadiness. She had not sought the fight, but the fight had found her, and she had stood her ground without surrendering. Her soul. Cheney, in her own home, stared at a framed photo of her father. His eyes seemed to bore into her across time, across generations of battles fought in the same halls of power. She could almost hear his voice. Never let them silence you. Never let them mistake calm for wisdom when it's just weakness in disguise. She clenched her jaw, whispering to the empty room, "They will remember my fire, not her smile." But somewhere in her heart she feared the opposite. The chamber doors would open again soon, and both women knew the next confrontation was inevitable. The ground beneath them was already fractured, fault lines spreading in every direction. It was no longer just about them. It was about the story America was telling itself, about what kind of strength it believed in, and when the plates of power shifted again, someone would be buried in the rubble. The hearing chamber felt less like a room of governance and more like a courtroom in which America itself was on trial. Cameras glinted like 1,000 eyes, capturing every flicker of emotion, every raised brow, every hesitation. The long oak table groaned beneath binders, thick with evidence, motions, and testimony. At the center of it all, Liz Cheney and Jasmine Crockett sat like opposing counsels, one fiery, the other composed, waiting for the gavel's fall that would summon their clash into being. The chairman's voice echoed, dry and formal. "We will now proceed with further questioning. Congresswoman Cheney, you may begin." Cheney rose slowly, her spine rigid, her papers clasped with almost surgical precision. There was no hesitation in her tone, only the cutting clarity of someone who had come not to probe but to prosecute. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the chamber, "you have chosen time and again to remain silent in moments where this committee sought truth. Is silence now your shield? Or is it your strategy?" A hush fell, every ear tilted toward the woman on the receiving end. Crockett did not flinch. She placed her palms gently on the polished wood, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Not the smirk of arrogance, but the quiet assurance of someone unwilling to be rushed into reaction. "My strategy, Congresswoman," Crockett said evenly, "is respect. Respect for the process, respect for this chamber, and respect for the American people who are tired of watching politicians turn hearings into shouting matches. Sometimes silence is not absence. Sometimes it is discipline." Cheney's jaw tensed. "Discipline without accountability is evasion. Do you expect this body to accept that passivity can substitute for courage?" Crockett's voice softened, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "And do you expect the people to believe that volume alone equals courage? I choose my battles carefully. I will not give chaos the gift of my voice when it serves nothing but spectacle." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Aides scribbled furiously. Somewhere a camera operator whispered, "That's the clip." But Cheney did not retreat. She pressed forward, her words now sharper, each syllable weighted like a gavel strike. "Congresswoman, when democracy is under assault, silence does. not protect it. Silence abets it. We were sent here not to observe but to fight. The chamber seemed to shrink, as though the air itself bent beneath the weight of her words. Cheney was fire, relentless and consuming. She believed herself the last sentinel on a crumbling wall, determined to make history remember her as one who did not falter. Crockett leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in thought. She had been raised in communities, where survival meant knowing when to speak and when to withhold, when to fight and when to bide time. She knew that silence was never empty. It was loaded with history, with patience, with centuries of voices denied. "Congresswoman Cheney," she said at last, her words measured like the beat of a drum. "My silence is not complicity, it is witness. It is a refusal to dignify bad faith with performance. You call it evasion. I call it protection, of myself, of my community, and of the integrity of this chamber. Because if we are to scream past one another, then we are not legislators. We are gladiators in a pit, and the people are nothing but spectators." The words landed like stone on marble. The hearing room seemed to pulse, a living organism caught between fire and stillness.